Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Eileen Graham. I'm the Policy and Strategy Director with Treehouse. And during today's Facebook Live, we're going to recap successes from the 2022 Washington State Legislative Session and the many new investments and policies that will support equity for youth who have experienced foster care. If you have questions for us, please post them in the comments and we'll get to as many as we can. And I'd like to turn it over to Dawn Rains. Dawn, can you introduce yourself, please?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Dawn Rains. I am Chief Policy and Strategy Officer here at Treehouse. I've been here 13 years in various roles, and I am also a former foster parent.
Thanks, Dawn. So to start it off, I'd love to just know, why is advocacy important when supporting youth and young adults in foster care?
Well, advocacy is a tool that we use to make systems change. We always say we could do great direct service all day long and change individual lives, but the young people that we serve experience the same repeated barriers and that are created by the systems that they interface with, whether it be the foster care system or the education system. So advocacy and all the policy work that Treehouse does is about changing the conditions that hold those barriers in place.
So the pandemic has continued to impact youth and young adults who have experienced foster care. What were the biggest factors that Treehouse considered when setting this year's legislative agenda?
Every year we, take a look around at the environment. We understand the barriers that our youth are experiencing. We talk to our state agency colleagues, to our advocacy colleagues, and I would say the three main factors that we were considering this year as we were planning our legislative agenda were about what we were seeing in the education system that our youth were experiencing, what our young people, young adults who are transitioning to adulthood were experiencing coming out of, hopefully out of the pandemic, and also implementation gaps. So not just, we can pass great law, but we also have to make sure that's implemented well. So we start with education. What we have seen over the course of the pandemic is that young people have disengaged from school. We're seeing that as kind of a widespread factor, and hopefully now, as young people are getting back into buildings, we're seeing a little bit more engagement. But now we're also needing to address kind of those academic remediation gaps that were experienced by those 18 plus months of distance learning. Also, we've really been experiencing some high wait lists in both our educational advocacy program across the state, as well as in certain pockets of our geographic pockets in our graduation success program. So we were thinking a lot about all of those factors. In terms of transitions, we've really been looking at, our students continue to be very mobile. They're changing placements often, they're changing schools often. I would say our young adults continue to experience economic hardship and housing instability that we were concerned about and wanted to address. And then finally, as I said, implementation gaps. There's a big difference between passing great law and then making sure that it gets implemented effectively. And as laws pass over time or as conditions change in the system, sometimes we'll notice a gap in how a law was intended to operate and how it actually is operating in practice. Luckily, because we serve so many young people across the state, we're serving about 50% of the school-age population in foster care. We have a good sense of how things are going out there. And so when we notice these kind of gaps, sometimes we come back to the legislature to correct it. Sometimes we can do that through practice advocacy with our state agency or school district colleagues. But oftentimes it'll also take legislative correction.
Thanks for kind of sharing that context about how we go about setting the agenda. With that, what would you consider the biggest win of the legislative session?
Well, I think I really have to start with the fact that that we secured $10.6 million in ongoing monthly payments to young people who are aging out of extended foster care at age 21, who have exited out of foster care during the pandemic time. early on in the pandemic, there was a federal moratorium on what we call aging out of foster care. But that moratorium came to an end last September 30th. And so at that point, it meant that 320 young adults who had continued to receive some monthly stipends no longer receive that kind of monthly payment support. We had recently surveyed young adults ages 23 to 26 who'd previously experienced foster care, and learned that of the nearly 700 young people, that 85% were experiencing housing needs or housing instability, 75% or 76% were behind on bills, 25% were actively unemployed, and that nearly 1/3 had unmet basic needs. Take into account also that 25% of those young people are also parenting. And so not only are they impacting that young adult, but also the next generation of children. And so, you know, in partnership with our colleagues at the Mockingbird Society, at Away Home Washington, Partners for Our Children, Legal Counsel for Youth and Children, lots of folks in this particular on this particular issue, we advocated to the governor and the legislature to provide some ongoing support for these young people who are aging out of foster care. Also, providing more time for the Department of Children, Youth, and Families to continue to improve its transition support strategies. We passed a law last session or there was a proviso last session to allow DCYF to spend some time really focusing on designing better transitions to adulthood with young people. And that work is still early in implementation. They have not yet had an opportunity to really improve their practice. And so we want to give a ramp, basically, an off-ramp into young adulthood. And so this support will go through June of 2023, which hopefully will give us some time and DCYF time to design some better transitions for young people.
I love that. Such a timely needed support that we realized what was happening with young adults, and with all of those strong partnerships, we're able to make something happen to support them. Pretty amazing. If you're just tuning in, feel free to throw a question in the comments and we'll get to as many as we can. Dawn, next question. So earlier you mentioned that gaps can exist between law and implementation. So when that happens, what steps do you take to remedy it, and how do you start that advocacy process?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Just as I said, just because there's great law doesn't mean there aren't gaps in implementation or practice, or sometimes we'll see really uneven practice across the state. So I'll share an example with you. Over many years, Washington State has passed a lot of laws that are meant to protect the educational rights of students in foster care. And in fact, Washington has some of the most progressive laws for students in foster care in the country, which we're really proud of. Treehouse has played a big role in making sure that that is true. Some of the examples include the right to stay in their school of origin when they come into foster care or change placements, transportation to that school if needed, even if they live outside of the district, partial credit if young people have to change schools mid-term, so mid-semester, mid-quarter, so they get credit for work that it has been completed, and then a review process that it happens for unexpected absences that occur because of their foster care status. So these are some of the examples of things that we have put into law. As these laws were passed, varying language was used about the definition or the description of youth in foster care, which created access barriers and confusion, and often leading to groups of students we would consider being in foster care being inadvertently excluded from these laws and services that are designed to support them. So these barriers regularly occurred for those students who were just entering foster care, kind of at the beginning part of the time that they're in foster care, and also at sort of the ending time when they're in foster care, maybe when they're being reunified with their families and they're in what we call a trial return home. And it's not a small group of students. There could be 600-700 students in that kind of time, in that kind of definition. It also could include those students who are under tribal jurisdiction, tribal child welfare jurisdiction, as well as the youth that are in what we sort of sometimes refer to as federal foster care, those unaccompanied refugee minor youth who are here in our country without parents or caretakers. So when starting the advocacy process, the first step was really to understand what are the gaps that are happening and why. And then over these last 5 years, Treehouse has worked with our state agency and nonprofit colleagues to really identify each spot in the law where a correction was needed. We partnered to create aligned language to be used in its place. So it took a long time to come to agreement on what that definition should be, and then identify all the places in law that it needed to be changed. This one's super technical, took a long time, wanted to make sure we weren't creating any unintended consequences by changing all of this language. This is a case where all of the partners actually drafted the bill together, which I have to say in sort of partnership world is like, the best possible case where we're all in agreement on these changes that need to happen. So along the way, we talked to legislators about the issue. We found a legislator, thanks Representative Alicia Rule, who really was our champion on this issue. And she sponsored the bill, and then she testified in support of it along the way, as well as many of our partners. So we're really excited that this bill passed the legislature almost unanimously. And while the bill was super technical and took a long time to achieve, it's an important step to achieving educational stability for our students experiencing foster care. It's one of those ones that, I always say not super sexy, but really important.
So I want to switch over to sort of the funding side of things for a moment. So about 30% of Treehouse's programs are supported by state government funding. And what is the process like to advocate for continued or sometimes new funding to continue to support Treehouse programming?
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes the funding is for Treehouse. We might also advocate for funding for other purposes as well. We're really fortunate that we have strong relationships and a reputation as a reliable service provider to our state agencies from our 30 years of partnership, 30 plus years of partnership. We also have long established relationships with champions in the legislature, which allows us the ability to bring them our requests. They really rely on us to identify kind of what are the top needs that you're seeing out there and what more is needed to address those needs. And many times they'll actually come to us and say, what is it? What is it now? Do you have an outstanding need? Sometimes we also partner with state agency colleagues to put forward requests to the governor in what state agencies called their decision packages for each of for the biennium budget or for that supplemental budget in the off year. So we have an example of that this time. We had one of our legislative champions, Senator Reuben Carlisle, come and say, "Hey, what are you seeing now? What's really needed for young people in foster care this year?" And we identified a really big need in our educational advocacy program. As you may know, our advocacy program serves our kids in pre-K through 12th grade, gets in there, resolves short-term education barriers that really need to be addressed, and things like enrollment, transition, special ed, discipline. And we are experiencing really, really long wait lists in some cases. And we are also seeing needs for those very, very highly mobile students. You may have heard in the media some stories about our young people who are in what we call sort of emergent or exceptional placements. So those young people staying in hotels overnight or staying in different placements night to night really need an advocate to address their education needs. And so we were very fortunate that the legislature, Reuben Carlisle, championed this request and put forward a request for $460,000 to allow Treehouse to hire 4 additional educational advocates to really focus on to address the wait lists and also those needs of those very highly mobile students. We're excited about that one. Sometimes we also advocate just to renew existing dollars, and we were very fortunate that our driver's assistance program was allocated $550,000. We needed $500,000 to at least maintain current levels of service. And we had some one-time funding that was in that mix that was expiring. And so very fortunate that we had strong champions in the transportation committees, and really want to thank Representative Jake Fye, who has been a real champion for this work, as well as Senator Claire Wilson, who has always championed this really critical need for our young people who are transitioning to adulthood to get to work and school. They need driver's licenses and also driver's ed, and car insurance keeps them and keeps all of us safer on the roads. Very fortunate that that we received that additional $550,000 that will allow us to sustain and slightly increase those services for our young adults.
Yeah. So again, if you have any questions, please add them in the comments. And Dawn, really big question. You know, we had a lot of people take action as we were advocating for these issues. Could you talk a little bit about, if someone is interested, how can they get involved in supporting Treehouse in this work?
Yeah, absolutely. The quickest and easiest thing you can do is sign up for our Advocacy Action Center. So we will send you alerts when we need our community to take action on behalf of our young people. It is one of those systems where you can sign up with your address, and it will identify quickly who your state legislators are. We will craft pre-crafted messages that you can edit to your heart's delight, and you can do all of that in about 1 minute. So it takes no time at all. I will say that legislators rely heavily on hearing from their constituents to understand what is important to you, and youth in foster care need more of our community to take action on their behalf. So you could sign up, and you can urge your friends and family. We could especially use folks to sign up all across the state, because we want to be advocating in every legislative district for the needs of our students. You know, you can also get to know your legislator, you know, look them up online, follow them on social media, get to know the issues that they really care about, what committees they serve on. Most of the legislators will also do district town halls where you can attend either in person or virtually, to find out what is going on in the legislature, what they're talking about. You'll find that each legislator, because of their committee assignments and maybe their professional background, focus on several core issues. And we're fortunate enough that we have several legislators who care very deeply about children and youth experiencing foster care. It's a great way to ask them to focus on these needs, or ask them questions about their thoughts or approach to policy and investments in youth in foster care. So yeah, those are a couple great ways to get involved. And also, if you're ever wanting to bring an issue related to foster care to our attention, please do. You can always contact us through the Treehouse website. And just, you know, thank you so much for your continued support. None of this would have happened without the advocacy of our communities. You know, I always joke that I can talk to legislators all day long, but what they really want to hear is from their constituents and from the young people who are impacted by these policies. So work is really not possible without your active involvement.
Second that. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today as we were recapping successes from the 2022 Washington State Legislative Session. So thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.